Finally have permission from the elders. Also acknowledging my ancestors, most recently my grandmother who passed away in 2010, whose dress I'm wearing today. I take her with me everywhere. I'm going to be speaking to you today about the sacred grove. And the title of my presentation is called Dancing the Sacred Grove. It's not a grammatical error. And not dancing in the sacred grove, but dancing the sacred grove. I'm particularly interested in the Protestant inheritance of the African American Orisha experience. And so in my work in Philadelphia, I observed Protestantisms, I would say, in African American Orisha practice, which I think have largely gone overlooked because the Lukumi tradition is so deeply connected with Catholicism. And in its newest iteration here in the United States, I think that there's a lot of work to be mined in terms of the Protestant African American experience and how that interfaces with the Orisha practice today. So, all right. So movement is intrinsic to Yoruba cosmology, and the Yoruba cosmos can be viewed as an ongoing interplay between the forces of expansion and contraction, symbolized in the all-light nature of Ogbe-Meiji and the all-dark nature of Oyeku-Meiji, which are the Olodu, or the parents of all other Odu. So when we look at the Odu, we see a blending between the elements of Oyeku-Meiji and Ogbe-Meiji as we go through the rest of the Odu. So this concept of movement that begins with Oyeku-Meiji and Ogbe-Meiji then becomes part, and it becomes intrinsic to Yoruba worship. And this is a picture of a woman who is worshiping at Oshun Ajigun, whereby if you've ever been to any Yoruba festival in Yoruba land, when people are worshiping, they're constantly moving. There is no worship that takes place in a still state. So they're either dancing or singing, and even when they're chanting, they're stepping from side to side, the hands are being raised. So movement is intrinsic to not only the cosmology and the philosophy of Yoruba religion, but also the practice of Yoruba religion. So my idea has to do with the fact that there are grammatical principles, and I'm referring to Sidney Mintz and Richard Price's work in the grammatical principles of culture in West Africa. And there are grammatical principles that were brought over by African American or Africans to the United States and to the Americas in general that were shared across several different ethnic regions. The Congo, the Fon, the Ewe, the Yoruba, the Mandinka, the Serer, the Susu, the Fulani, the Vai, the Bulum, the Sherbro, they all share this list of beliefs and more. And it is these shared concepts which allow them to come together to create Vodun, to create the Lukumi system, to create Candomblé. It's because they have these shared categories of significance that allow them to create systems that were new, but that were firmly rooted in the African philosophies that they came out of. For my purposes, two categories of significance I want to focus on: the existence and centrality of the sacred grove, and the centrality of movement and its role in creating sacred space in traditionalist belief. And again, this is at Oshun Ajigun, and people are getting it in, just dancing. What is the sacred grove? This is at Oshun Oshogbo in the grove there. So in Africa, sacred groves exist not only in traditional religious systems, I think that's a false division, but we'll say initiatory systems. In the Panguima, the sacred grove of the Sande Society, the Poro Society of Sierra Leone, in Mande, in the Como Society, the Kwore, the Nya, the Jo, and then obviously in for Nigeria, for example, in Oshogbo and numerous other sacred groves. In the Americas, I would say that physical, geographical places become sacred groves like the Quilombos and then the hush harbors in the African American experience, particularly the African American Protestant experience. So we have, in West Africa, the sacred grove is a natural environment, a hallowed ground, a place wherein humans can experience and commune with the divine, a place where permanent spiritual and social transformation takes place, a place where ritual is enacted, a space where time is altered, and it is also an ancestrally designated physical place. So it's not just any random place. It's a place that has been sacred for antiquity. People have been going to this place for numerous reasons, and they're continuing to visit this place, this space. These spaces are also created temporarily in Africa as well, but I would argue that there is a prevalence of this former type of space, this physical, permanent, sacred space, where African Americans don't necessarily have that here in the United States. So, in West Africa, the sacred grove requires attendance, tightness. If you've been to Oshun Oshogbo, you know all about tightness. Touch, you know about being touched too. Tempo, tonality, a target, and movement. So there is an energy that is generated by the fullness of the grove being filled with people. There is the energy that comes about from people being in contact with each other. There is the rhythm that is being played in the music and the chanting. You have all these different troubadours moving around with the dundun, with the batas, or there's a rhythm that's taking place. And then you have a target, which in Oshun Oshogbo, for example, is Oshun. And then you have movement, which is constantly taking place. One of my favorite things to observe when I was at Oshun Oshogbo is people just randomly breaking out and dance. You know, you could be walking behind somebody, not paying attention, and bump into them because they've stopped to sing and chant and dance just in a moment. So this is something that is constantly taking place throughout worship in the sacred grove in Oshun Oshogbo. In North America, the sacred grove, or the hush harbor, is a natural environment or a structure, such as a cabin, a place wherein humans can experience and commune with the divine, a place where spiritual transformation may take place and internal social status may change, but external status did not. So we're talking about slaves going into secret places where they could become empowered, where they could own themselves, where they could have agency in spite of being the subaltern in the outer society. They could enact ritual in these spaces. They altered time in these spaces. And here in the United States, the sacred grove, or the hush harbor, becomes a response to white oppression and restriction, and it becomes a place for the enactment of subversive acts, because everything that they were doing in these spaces was subversive. They preached about freedom, they yearned for freedom, they talked about freedom, they invoked freedom, so this was all subversive and a part of the reason why they were doing it in secret. And finally, the hush harbor is a safe space. So they were safe to do this without the retributive actions of their white masters or owners. So as a grammatical principle, the sacred grove was a well-known and understood concept throughout West Africa, which would have been understood by African arrivals to the Americas, and its existence provided a ready-made context for the expansion of its function to include the provision of a safer space from whites and the enactment of spiritual resistance and freedom. So the sacred grove in North America becomes the hush harbor, and this is where slaves could temporarily escape to worship, and contemporarily practitioners of African traditional religions still have need of hush harbors. So here we have the sacred grove in Africa becoming the hush harbor in North America, and this is an image of a ring shout that's taking place in South Georgia. And if you notice, the sacred grove in the Americas wasn't only something that was outside. For example, slaves would sometimes dampen blankets and hang them around their beds or hang them around areas inside of their cabins so that when they were getting happy and making noise, the sound wouldn't escape out. Or they would take these big kettles and put them in the middle of the room so that the sound would get trapped in the kettle but not go outside. And they would also station people outside to make sure their activities weren't discovered. So you get this sense of being enclosed. Even in this picture, you see how low the ceiling is. So this is also a sacred grove, even though it's not outside in a natural environment. Contemporary conditions that necessitate the perpetuation of the sacred grove in Philadelphia include city living and inaccessibility of appropriate natural surroundings, social stigma, and also legal issues. So we still have need of these protected sacred spaces because of the things that we do that attract negative attention from the outside world, and we want to be free to be able to do these things without being bothered by folk. So, in the context of the city, the sacred grove must constantly be taken down and recreated for ritual purposes, particularly in the case of community ride ritual. So what elements help create this safe and sacred space? Again, just like in the sacred grove in Africa, attendance, tightness, touch, tempo, tonality, target, and movement. So again, here we're at my friend Nalo's house celebrating Obatala. It's tight. It's always tight. So each one of the above elements helps to prepare the space where the bembe is to take place and allow the space to play its role for the purpose of the bembe to be served, i.e. for blessings to be bestowed on people, for the orisha to descend into the space, etc. So this is a pictorial rendition of my concept, whereby you have Africans with the physical sacred grove, which is outside, and they're traditionalists. Africans come to the Americas and they become Protestants after at least 150 years. They embody the hush harbor. So the hush harbor is no longer something that's outside of them. It's something that is inside of them, which they can invoke and create at will. And then we have ourselves, African American Orisha devotees, who inherit this legacy, but we also are enacting this older layer of utilizing the sacred grove.